can masquerade as spiritual truth is as old as civilization itself, yet we still find ourselves bewildered by how easily the human mind is deceived. We're looking today at an essay by Mustafa Sajjad Haider, written in July 2026, which tackles this exact paradox. Why do intelligent, educated people continue to fall for spiritual charlatans? Haider uses the vivid image of a street performer, a madari, pulling a pigeon out of a hat. No one calls that a miracle. We laugh, we toss a few coins, but we know it's a trick. And yet, the same logic fails us when a self-proclaimed spiritual leader uses the same psychological levers to demand worship. It's a striking comparison because it highlights the double standard in our perception. When we see a performer on a stage or a street corner, our skepticism filter is fully engaged. We've paid for an illusion, and we expect one. But the moment the setting shifts to a shrine, a digital platform, or a private gathering, and the performer uses religious or metaphysical language, that filter often vanishes. Haider is essentially asking what happens to our collective common sense in that transition. Why does the Madari become a Mahatma just because the costume changes? He seems particularly frustrated that well-educated and sensible people aren't immune to this. Usually, we assume education is a shield against superstition. If you've studied science, law, or history, you should be able to spot a sleight of hand. But the reality on the ground, especially in South Asian contexts where the peer murati culture is so prevalent, suggests that education might even make people more susceptible to complex, sophisticated deceptions. There's actually a lot of psychological research that backs up that frustration. Being educated in a professional sense, knowing how to code or how to perform surgery, doesn't necessarily mean you've developed critical thinking skills regarding your own emotional vulnerabilities. In fact, people with high intelligence are often better at motivated reasoning. If they want to believe a spiritual leader is genuine because they're in a moment of crisis, they use their intelligence to construct much more elaborate justifications for that belief than an uneducated person would. They don't just see a miracle, they build a whole philosophical framework to explain why it must be one. Haider mentions how people give these figures a spiritual status and start worshiping them. It's not just a casual interest, it's a surrender of the self. From a technical standpoint, how do these leaders move someone from interested observer to devoted follower? Is it all just tricks, or is there a deeper manipulation of the social environment? It's a multi-layered process. It starts with what social psychologists call love bombing, creating an environment of intense acceptance and community. But the technical magic Haider talks about is the hook. Think about the stadium healers or Amils who claim to know things about a person's past or health without being told. Often it's cold reading, a technique where you use high-probability guesses and watch for subtle physical cues to refine your prophecy. Or hot reading, where information is gathered beforehand through social media or plant followers in the crowd. When a leader tells you the name of your deceased aunt, your brain experiences a massive dopamine hit. The rational mind shuts down, and the spiritual interpretation takes over. And that leads back to Haider's point about the pigeon in the hat. If a magician did that, you'd think he's a good researcher. But if a peer does it, it's taken as a sign from the divine. It's almost as if the sacredness of the subject matter makes it feel off-limits for questioning. People feel that doubting the leader is equivalent to doubting God or the spiritual path itself. That's the spiritual abuse component. Many of these figures explicitly teach that thinking is the enemy of faith. They frame critical questions as whispers of the devil or signs of a darkened heart. When you institutionalize the idea that doubt is a sin, you create a perfect vacuum for exploitation. Haider captures this beautifully with his quote, "Kama angusht badandan hai is kaya likie." The pen is stuck between the teeth in amazement. He's looking at this phenomenon where the very tools of human progress, logic, and literacy are being bypassed by primitive emotional triggers. Let's dig into the pigeon and hat analogy more. Haider says no sane person would call it a miracle. But isn't there a fine line between a miracle and a karamat or mugiza in Islamic tradition? Historically, how did scholars distinguish between legitimate spiritual phenomena and mere madariism or sleight of hand? That is a central debate in Islamic philosophy. Thinkers like Ibn Khaldun or Al-Ghazali were actually very skeptical of public displays of wonders. They made a sharp distinction. A true miracle is meant to serve a divine purpose, often to validate a prophet's message, and it's usually accompanied by a life of impeccable character. The Madari, on the other hand, performs for dad, praise, and pockets. Haider notes that people might empty their pockets for a trick, but they shouldn't lose their minds. The classical tradition warns that istidraj, a deceptive increase in worldly success or apparent powers, can be a test from God and a sign of spiritual ruin rather than growth. If the person performing the wonder isn't following basic moral and ethical standards, the wonder itself is irrelevant. Yet we see the opposite. We see leaders with massive wealth, questionable ethics, and even reports of abuse, yet their followers' numbers only grow. Haider is sitting there scratching his head, wondering why. Is it perhaps that in an increasingly uncertain world, the certainty these charlatans provide is more valuable to people than the truth? Exactly. We live in an era of cognitive overload. Whether it's economic instability or the constant noise of digital life, people are exhausted. Thinking is hard. Being responsible for your own spiritual and material fate is terrifying. A charlatan offers a shortcut. They say, give me your agency, follow these specific rituals, and I will fix your marriage, your debt, and your afterlife. It's the ultimate marketing funnel, as some critics call it. They aren't selling spirituality, they're selling a relief from the burden of choice. Even for an educated person, that's an incredibly seductive product. There's also the social aspect. If everyone around you, your family, your social circle, regards someone as a saint, it takes immense courage to be the one who says, wait, that's just a pigeon in a hat. The cost of being right can be social isolation. Haider's essay feels like a plea for that courage, but he admits he's scratching his head. It's as if he's reached a dead end in understanding the human capacity for self-deception. It's a very honest admission. He's essentially saying that logic has its limits. You can explain the how, the cold reading, the psychological grooming, the groupthink, but the why remains a mystery of the human soul. Why do we want to be fooled? There's a comfort in the mystery. If the world is just cause and effect, it's cold. If a man can pull a pigeon out of a hat and it means I'm special and God is watching me, then the world feels magical again. People are trading their rationality for a sense of enchantment. But the trade is rarely fair. Haider points out that people give these figures a spiritual status and worship them. This often leads to financial exploitation and, in many documented cases in Pakistan and elsewhere, much worse, physical and emotional abuse. When you grant someone divine authority based on a trick, you're removing the safeguards that keep human power in check. A Madari in the street is harmless because he has no authority. A Madari in a pulpit is dangerous because he can command your life. That's the core of the danger. In any other field, we have regulators. If a doctor commits fraud, they lose their license. If a pilot fails a test, they don't fly. But the spiritual market is almost entirely unregulated. In fact, in many cultures, any attempt to regulate it or call out fraud is met with accusations of blasphemy or disrespecting the elders. This sacred shield allows the most predatory individuals to operate with total impunity. Haider is trying to pierce that shield by using a very common analogy. He's trying to bring the conversation back down to the level of the street performer to remind us that a trick is a trick, regardless of who performs it. It's interesting he mentions talking, batin banana koyom nahi hai. He's targeting the eloquence of these leaders. Often, it's not even a physical trick, it's just a sleight of word. They use complex, rhythmic language, quote, scriptures out of context, and weave stories that put a veil over people's intellect. If someone sounds sufficiently deep and confusing, we often mistake that for wisdom. Linguistic manipulation is a huge part of the toolkit. In many South Asian languages, including Urdu, which Haider is writing in, there's a tradition of adab and sukhan, the art of speech. Charlatans tap into that. They use jargon that sounds spiritual but is functionally empty. It's what philosophers call deepities, statements that seem profound but are either trivially true or completely meaningless when analyzed. The light within you is the shadow of the unseen. It sounds beautiful, but what does it actually mean? If you can't explain it, you assume the teacher is on a level you can't reach yet. It's a way of maintaining the knowledge gap that keeps the follower dependent. And Haider's reaction, Kama Angush Badandan, reflects the silence of the intellectual class. When speech is so thoroughly corrupted by these word merchants, what can a writer do? He's essentially pointing to the poverty of language when faced with such widespread voluntary delusion. He's asking, is there anyone who can shed light on this, almost as a challenge to the listeners? The light has to be a return to the basics. Haider's own analogy is the answer. We need to stop looking for shortcuts to the divine and start looking at the fruits of a person's character. If a leader's miracles don't lead to more compassion, more justice, and more personal freedom for the followers, then they are just pigeons in a hat. A true teacher should empower you to think for yourself, not make you dependent on their supernatural interventions. The Madari wants your coins and your applause. A true guide wants your growth. It's also a reminder that intelligence isn't just about what you know, but how you apply your doubt. We live in a time where we're told to trust our gut, but the gut is easily manipulated by a good storyteller. Haider's essay is a call to trust your intellect instead, to realize that the akal, the reason, is a divine gift specifically intended to protect us from being misled. If we set it aside, we're not being more spiritual, we're just being more vulnerable. And the cost of that vulnerability is high. It erodes the social fabric. When a society begins to value miracles over merit and tricks over truth, it loses its ability to solve real problems. You can't pray away a failing education system or perform a karamat to fix a broken economy. By focusing on the madaris, we're ignoring the real work of building a sane, just society. Haider's head-scratching is a reflection of a society that is literally stumped by its own superstitions. Ultimately, the essay ends on a note of uncertainty. He doesn't have a silver bullet solution. He just lays out the observation and asks us to think. It's a powerful stance, to admit that even after writing an entire piece, you're still left with more questions than answers. It forces the reader to stop being a passive consumer of wisdom and start doing the mental work themselves. That might be the most spiritual thing about the whole piece. He isn't claiming to be the new anti-guru who has all the secrets. He's just a man with a pen, observing a tragedy and asking us to look at it with clear eyes. If we can see the pigeon for what it is, a bird, a trick, a distraction, then perhaps the veil over our akal will start to lift. The distinction between a spectacle and a transformation is where we find the truth. We should remember that while a trick can fill a stadium, only the truth can set a mind free. If this conversation made you think twice about the miracles you see online or in your community, share it with someone who might be scratching their head too.